Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books, where each week we interview an author of a newly published work of nonfiction that we believe is worth your time. The views expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect the views of the University of Texas Brownsville or this station. And now, here is your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, Associate Professor of Communication at the University of Texas at Brownsville and Texas Southmost College. And with me today is Mr. Tom Fitzgerald. His bio says he led a Huckleberry Finn childhood on the St. Lawrence River before undertaking formal studies in physics, mathematics, law, industrial management, and English. He has served as a door-to-door salesman of home study courses, a vocational counselor for adults and children with developmental disabilities, a stockbroker, the assistant to the president of a large healthcare corporation, a lobbyist, a technical writer, a corporate manager. And in the latter two capacities, his employers have included AT&T, Bell Laboratories, Lucent Technologies, NEC, IBM, Lotus Development, and Pfizer Pharmaceuticals. Tom served as a Navy UDT SEAL during the Vietnam era and has swum several long distances, including across the eastern end of Lake Ontario, a distance greater than the English Channel. Once also an avid runner, Tom ran the Boston Marathon 3 times before a fall on the black ice abruptly ended a lifelong addiction to endorphins. He and his wife of 44 years, a marriage and family therapist, have 3 grown sons and 3 grandsons, and they live in New England. He's the author of 3 works of fiction, and that's the first thing I want to address with my listeners. I know that I have never before done a fiction book, but I was compelled by this one to do it. The book is Poor Richard's Lament, a most timely tale. Mr. Fitzgerald, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
You know, I was struck by a couple of things at the beginning of this, which are also part of what caught my attention about this book. I love the publisher's note that says that you don't follow their usual format, and that you if there's a short way to say something, you say it the longest way. And so it was really interesting that the publisher put that disclaimer on this book at the beginning.
Yes. What they're referring to there, because Ben Franklin is the main character of this book, he brings his 18th century diction with him. And 18th century diction tend to be a little bit longer and more elaborate, sometimes convoluted, than the way we speak now. And so it was a backhanded compliment of being able to replicate the diction of 2 centuries ago.
And then being able to contrast that with the way people speak today for our contemporary characters. I also appreciated the historian forward, Michael Zuckerman, and he wrote, as an historian who's devoted a goodly portion of his professional life to studying the life and times of Ben Franklin, I was not far into the first half of Fitzgerald's delicious invention when I found myself marveling at the depth of the author's understanding of America's greatest founding father. So a Benjamin Franklin historian has endorsed this work for how real you got with him.
Yes, and that was a huge project, and that's the reason why it took me 9 years to write this book, is because I chose Franklin, or Franklin chose me. Who knows what happened here? I had to immerse. Excuse me, fighting a cold here. Mm-hmm. I had to immerse myself in his life and just absorb him into myself, because I had to look through his eyes, and the only way you can look through somebody's eyes is to get inside. Mm-hmm. And that's what I did with Ben Franklin. I read every biography that's been written about him in the last 10, 20 years, and a lot of his original writings. Fortunately, Yale University had collected these into 38 volumes at Yale University, and 2 years into the project, they digitized them and put them online so I could go and access all those original writings.
That's tremendous. And it's also, the other thing in front that I wanted to make note of, because I found it fascinating, is you have 5 pages of milestones in the life of Ben Franklin. And what struck me about his accomplishments were that, aside from dalliances from women, with different women, he spent a lot of time investigating and learning things and doing scientific stuff, and then not patenting it, just wanting everybody to be able to share what he created.
Yes, that was a hallmark of Ben Franklin. It's just his instinctive generosity toward the common good. Mm-hmm. He invented the lightning rod, the Franklin stove, the bifocal lens, and on and on and on and on. And he was offered patents on all these inventions, and he could have made a fortune on each one of them. But instead of doing that, he just gave them to the public domain. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, allowed multiple manufacturers to manufacture the items and make them available at the lowest possible price, so everybody can invent a benefit from them. And people don't realize how key the lightning rod was, because back in his day, there were fires all the time. A lightning strike on any house or church meant a fire, and same in Europe. I mean, how many times did London burn down? How many times did Philadelphia burn down, and Boston? Mm-hmm. And so this single device made a marked change in people's lives, because they didn't have to fear fire as much as they used to fear it. Mm-hmm. And of course, this also led into Ben Franklin. He said, well, while he was at it, not only did he invent the lightning rod, but he also invented the fire insurance concept that we are certainly familiar with today, and also the bucket brigade. You know, the having centralized, just like militias, centralized soldiers when you need the soldiers. He centralized fire brigades when you had to have multiple people involved.
Mm-hmm. He obviously was a man of singular intelligence, and it blew me away to read that his father removed him from school to make him an indentured worker.
Yes.
And then indentured him to a brother later. And so when he got into publishing, he didn't have the formal education of...
he did not.
But
no,
somehow he was brilliant.
He was self-taught, and it just that alone is a marvelous a facet of his life. He taught himself to write by gathering what magazines that he could. Now, of course, back then all the magazines came from London, because they had the wherewithal to produce things like that. But he would get his hands on a magazine, and he would read the articles. Then he would put the magazine aside, and then he would try to replicate the article that he just read and improve it. Uh-huh. And this was a hallmark of Ben Franklin his whole life. He invented a lot of things, but he borrowed a lot of things also, and then improved them. And that's the way he educated himself. He read. You have the mythology of Abraham Lincoln off in the Illinois woods, mm-hmm. teaching himself by candlelight. Franklin did pretty much the same thing in Boston. He went to school at Boston, what was now about Boston Latin School. His father put him in there for a few weeks under the hope that the father was running out of sons. He had 17 kids, but Ben was the last male. He was number 15. Mm-hmm. Then there were 2 girls after him, so he was the last. Back then, it was a tradition that you had to steer one of your sons into the clergy, mm-hmm. and it became evident that Ben Franklin was not a candidate for the clergy. So the father yanked him out and indentured him eventually to James, his brother James, who taught him the printing business. Mm-hmm.
And the kinds of things he wrote about, I mean, the titles of Articles of Belief and Acts of Religion, a proposal promoting useful knowledge, a dissertation upon liberty and necessity, pleasure and pain. He obviously was a deep thinker about a variety of topics. Do you think that his devotion to deism or his membership in the Freemasons influenced his thinking in any way?
Well, it's a chicken and the egg thing. Which one influences the other? It's really hard to tell. Mm-hmm. But he couldn't help himself. He just was so curious, and he learned, because he had such a big brain. He learned very early what a big brain could do on its own without being hindered by dogma. Mm-hmm. He became very suspicious of dogma very early on, because he saw some of the bad aspects of it. I mean, like everything else, it had good aspects, it had bad aspects, but he found it stultifying, and his brain was so eager to know that it eventually propelled him to leave Boston. He left when he was 17. You can't really say he ran away from home. He wasn't running away as much as he was running toward. He didn't know what the toward was yet, but he knew it was out there, and he had to go find it.
And he did such wonderful things in the world of diplomacy for the United States during its birth years. But let's take us through what Poor Richard's Lament is about. Let's start with the context of this contemporary president and the picture you paint of a self-made man who's a Republican, who's 5 points down in the polls, who has some loyal folks that work for him and admire him. And this is the context we're going to find ourselves in.
Yes. There are really two stories. There's a story within a story, and what you're alluding to now is the story within the story.
Mm-hmm.
And I created that for several reasons. One of you just alluded to was, here's what American politics has come to since Ben Franklin, passed on back in 1790. Here's the world as it is now, and you get opportunity as you go along to contrast that with Ben Franklin and the Founding Fathers and some of the sacrifices they made. And also it allows Ben Franklin, in the first half of the novel, Ben Franklin is in a celestial court, and he's being examined, confronted with the negative aspects of his life. And so the story within the story gives me an opportunity for Ben Franklin to get glimpses of what's going on. He doesn't know it, but he's being prepared in the first half of the novel to come back to America in modern times, mm-hmm. and to bear witness to what's to become. And then some of the characters that are introduced in the story within the story, he meets, toward the end of the story. Mm-hmm. So there's a coming together, a dramatic confluence of these two threads.
And the character of Ben Franklin being what it is, he's not real sure that America has evolved in the right direction, right?
Yes, yeah. But the reader is not hit over the head about this. By putting Ben Franklin in modern times and preparing him to see with fresh eyes, the reader is also, because you're seeing things through Ben Franklin's eyes, the reader is also prepared in the first half of the novel for the second half, and is just following Ben Franklin through his odyssey of witness from Boston to New York to Philadelphia. And so the reader is allowed to see things with fresh eyes. And it's an important part of the novel, but it's subtle. It's not something that just hits you over the head every 5 minutes.
But, the cover of the book has a tear in Ben Franklin's eye, and the subtitle of Poor Richard's Lament is a most timely tale, so mentioning the time aspect. But why is there a tear in his eye? I always imagine Ben Franklin with a twinkle in his eye.
Yeah, well, he had that's for sure. Mm-hmm. But in this case, the lament is multifaceted, or has layers. It's his lament over regrets of opportunities missed or things that he did that he wished that he hadn't done. He was not an exemplary parent or spouse. In fact, he treated his family sometimes with startling cruelty. Mm-hmm. He participated in the commerce and convenience of slavery and was hypocritical around some of that activity.
Yeah, it's interesting that he had documents against slavery, but he had slaves as well.
Yes, he did. In fact, he had slaves right up to the end. He became titular president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society in the last year of his life, but he still had a slave home in his home, even at that time. Mm-hmm. But I think the circumstances were that the slave was more of a family member than a slave at that point, and the slave probably could have walked any time he wanted to, but he was just felt part of the family.
You had mentioned that he was sometimes tough on his family, and of course there's mention of illegitimate children, but near the end of his life he revised his will to give daughter Sally most of the property, grandson Temple most of the books and papers, and gave nothing to his son.
Yeah, that's a really sad part. That's one of his laments in the novel. Ben Franklin's oldest son, William, mm-hmm. Went with Ben Franklin when he first went to England, and Ben Franklin made a conscious effort to anglify his son, William. He introduced him to British culture, encouraged William to dress the part of being a British gentleman. He studied law in Middle Temple, became a lawyer, and eventually got an appointment as Royal Governor of New Jersey, swore allegiance to the crown. So when it came time, or when the revolution started to break, Ben Franklin was one of the last people to come around to a revolution. He wanted to preserve the Commonwealth. He wanted the colonies to remain with England.
Mm-hmm.
So when the revolution hit, Ben Franklin, once he changed his mind, he wanted William to change his mind. And William said, "No, I'm not going to change my mind. I've sworn allegiance to the king, and I'm the king's servant." Well, Ben was having none of this, and so they became estranged, and they never reconciled, even though the son, years after the revolution, tried several times to get Ben to reconcile with him. Ben refused.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the reason Ben was so angry that he disinherited his son. He didn't completely disinherit him. He gave him a few worthless things, like the books that you never returned. Some land in Nova Scotia was absolutely no good for anything. So he just put a little salt in the wound to give it a little revenge. He might the words he might use.
And that will revision was just 2 years before his death.
Yes. Yeah.
Huh.
So
he's in the Supreme Celestial Court of Petitions, and he's been confined to the Plantation of the Unrepentant for 200 years.
Yes.
And he has to sort of explain to folks, explain himself and defend himself. And he does seem to be unrepentant, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. But as the trial goes on, he becomes more and more repentant. He begins to really see some of the things that he did that just are inexcusable in any time or place. Like one of the ads that he's presented, one of the ads he carried in the Pennsylvania Gazette concerning sale of slaves, presents a young mother, and two children, one a toddler and the other a little older, and the ad says, "For sale together or separately."
Mm-hmm.
So here's this just totally these people have been totally stripped of their humanity, and they're just chattels. And of course, Ben was young back then, and he was a product of his time. So you can understand why he got into this. But in hindsight, when you look back, he's asked, are there certain crimes that are just unforgivable in any time or place? And he's presented, is slavery one of those crimes?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I'm not telling people what to think about things like that. I'm just presenting the questions the way they would have been presented in a real court.
Obviously, I have nowhere near the knowledge you have of this book that's 9 years in the making and the 38 sources you mentioned. But I've always followed the mythification of our founding fathers and admire both John Adams and Ben Franklin. Why were John Adams and Ben Franklin adversaries?
Yeah, it was really one-sided. Ben Franklin had no animosity against John Adams at all. John Adams was I don't know if you saw the HBO series.
Yes, oh yes.
But yes, that to me is a fair portrait of John Adams. He was a vain man. He was a brilliant man. He was a brilliant orator, and that was the one area where he could excel that Ben Franklin could not.
Mm-hmm.
And John Adams felt that Franklin got a lot of ill-deserved, or at least a lot of the credit that John should have gotten, Franklin got.
Mm-hmm.
And in some regards, you could build a case for that, because without the oratory of John Adams, the revolution may not have happened, because he got people so worked up that they had to do something. Ben Franklin didn't have that talent.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when Ben Franklin was assigned to be the commissioner to the French court, to get the French to support the revolution, Adams came over to replace one of the other commissioners, and he saw Franklin leading what he thought was a dissipated lifestyle. Didn't understand that people stayed up at all hours in the French culture. This is the way that they entertained each other and the way they got business done.
Mm-hmm.
So Adams used this as an opportunity to try to malign Ben's reputation back in the colonies. He would send messages back saying that Ben Franklin is not representing the colonies in a respectable manner. when actually what he was doing, it was just joining with the culture. He was a genius in doing that. He was like a chameleon, a social chameleon.
Mm-hmm.
He could just blend right in with the locals and get things done.
And really, he was instrumental in making sure that we had allies during the Revolution because of how he did diplomacy.
Absolutely, yes. And it's hard to imagine how the colonies would have won the Revolutionary War without the French support. It was critical. Mm-hmm. And Franklin worked hard to get that support. And he did it through personal relationship. John Adams met sort of the prime minister regime, the guy that Franklin was working with. Adams wanted to meet him, so he went to meet him by himself, and he took his puritanical attitude with him and his sternness, and he more or less lectured Virginie that they needed to do more for the colonies. And afterward, Virginie told Franklin, said, "Get that guy out of here. He's going to screw everything up."
Yeah.
So they sent him over to the Netherlands to try to get him out of the picture.
Mm-hmm. We talked a little bit about he didn't want copyrights or patents or money from his inventions. The lightning rod is one we talked about, and the Franklin stove, of course, is a famous invention of his. What would you say is his business philosophy? Because he never wanted for anything, as near as I can tell.
Yeah. Well, his philosophy was just to do the most good for the most people. He was, and he brought that to his business. One of his early projects, personal projects, was moral improvement. He was the first self-help guy. His autobiography is sort of the first self-help book program. And in that, he lays out his project for moral perfection, and he lists 13 virtues. And the first two he's known for, industry and frugality. Mm-hmm. And what you realize is these are secular virtues. These are the virtues that any young man needs to embrace if he's going to be successful in the world of commerce back in the 18th century. You must be industrious. You must be frugal. You must be resolute. You must be orderly. And on and on and on. And this is not pie in the sky philosophy. This is the way he had conducted his own business life, and why he was so successful. Mm-hmm. He had the printing business. He had the almanacs. He had the newspaper. He had a shop. And he made by the time he was 42, he was a very wealthy man.
He retired at 42, and that's when he really began his career. That was I guess you would call it his founding father career.
Yes, his founding father career and his scientific career. Mm-hmm. And just the amount of sacrifice that he was willing to make for not only just giving up the patents, but another great story about him is when General Braddock came over from England with a big army to chase the French out of the Ohio Valley. When Braddock arrived, of course, he didn't have horses and wagons, but he needed horses and wagons for the campaign, so he demanded that the local farmers provision him with horses and wagons. And the colony said, the farmers said, no way, because we don't trust that we'll be compensated if we don't get them back. So the general was going to take what he needed, and Ben Franklin got wind of this, so he rode in on his white horse and said to the farmers, I will put up bond for all your horses and wagons. Just give the general what he needs. Mm-hmm. Well, of course, General Braddock marches into the woods, and he meets up with Indian tribes aligned with the French, and his army is just decimated. He loses half his men, 2/3 of his officers, and his own life. And of course, the farmers don't get their wagons and horses back. So Ben Franklin is out. All the funds, his entire fortune is gone.
Wow! Because
he was willing to do that. Well, 4 or 5 months later, the British government decided that they needed to compensate him for what he had done. So he got his fortune back. But the willingness of that man to give everything away for the common good is a hallmark of how he conducted his life. Not only the last 42 years of his life, but also the first 42. He just had that generosity of spirit we don't see a lot of now, so it really stands out.
I have a question that came up for me when you mentioned the 13 virtues, and it goes to urban legend, and I just want to confirm whether it's true or not. They say that somebody suggested that he add humility to the list because he had apparently omitted it.
Yes, that's a great story. Yeah, because he came up, his project for moral perfection actually started out with 12 virtues. Mm-hmm. So he was telling one of his Quaker friends about and this program that he was writing up for moral perfection, and he listed off the virtues that he had under the umbrella of this program. And the Quaker looked at him and said, "Mr. Franklin, you might want to add in the 13th virtue, humility." Mm-hmm. So Franklin got what the Quaker friend was telling him and added as the last virtue, and it may be the greatest of his virtues because it embodied the man. Franklin was truly a humble person.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's take him into modern America, and he's looking at what's going on now and the impasse of the polarized political parties. Would he favor one party over another, and what would he think about the impasse in Congress?
Yeah, because he was a free thinker, he was really a product of the Enlightenment, mm-hmm. and he was suspicious of dogma early on. He witnessed it firsthand in Puritan Boston. He's not a man who would embrace any kind of dogma, and therefore would not belong to a political party. Either the Democrats or Republicans of today, or any of the factions that existed back then. He thought that a dogma was more of a danger than a help. So if he lived in our having our time, I have no doubt. Of course, it's hard to speak for somebody else, but for what I know of the man, he would be the guy behind the scenes that is trying to get the dogmatic factions to let go of their dogma long enough to reach some kind of compromise for the good of the whole.
Mm-hmm. He was deeply involved in the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, and I can't find it right now. I was looking for the quote, but you cite him saying, "There are parts of this Constitution I don't agree with, but yeah. I'm getting older and learning to respect other people's opinions." Yeah. Was that reflective of who he was becoming as he aged?
Yeah, that was the speech that he wrote for delivery just minutes before the vote was taken for the Constitution. Mm-hmm. He was too weak to at that point to read it himself, so he had James Wilson, part of the Pennsylvania delegation, read it for him. It's a brilliant piece of work. It just trying to put everything in the context that says, it doesn't matter how much you believe in your point of view. There are other point of views, and nothing gets done. No progress is made unless everybody gives up a little of what they want, so you can do the most good under the circumstances. You can always change your mind later, but you have to let go of something in order to reach an agreement, and everybody has to win.
Mm-hmm. And it was the right words at the right time, even though he couldn't speak them himself.
Yes, yeah. He wasn't an orator anyway, as I mentioned earlier. John Adams was the orator, mm-hmm. But he was the behind the scenes. He was the pen man. He penned his words and published them. That was his oratory. And the only speech I know of that he ever made himself directly is when he stood in front of at the bar of the House of Commons and argued against the Stamp Act mm-hmm. for its abolition. And they actually did repeal that. Right? They did, and that was remarkable back then because the British looked down their nose at the colonists and any kind of forward confrontation like that was ill considered, mm-hmm. and so that was part of his charm, is that he could just get past all that stuff and just reach people at a different level. It's
interesting reflection on his thoughts that we're going to have to close with. Unfortunately, we're out of time. But in his compendium of little ditties and doodles for the general amusement of the irredeemably idle. He once wrote, "We are the slaves of our biology and our ideology, but the clowns of our theology."
Yes.
I think that's a nice, tidy package about how he dealt with life.
Yes. Yeah, that's Ben Franklin at his best.
We've been talking with Tom Fitzgerald, the author of Poor Richard's Lament, a most timely tale. This is an interesting work and readily available. PoorRichardsLament.com is one of the places you can go to get it for sure. I'd like to remind our listeners that if you miss our 4 broadcasts each week, you can also go on our Facebook page, Good Books Radio, and hear recent programs there. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. Thanks for listening.